In Chinese medicine, working along the bladder meridian has many different uses, though one which resonates deeply with me is how it is described to balance the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. When this technique is taught, you're often encouraged to start at the horse's head and work back to their hind foot. However, I personally like starting at the horse's hind foot and working forward to the horse's head to help draw awareness to their hind end. It's also a nice way to help your horse to down regulate if they have a lot of tension around their head and neck before working directly over that area. So you're going to run your index and middle finger from the lateral aspect of the horse's coronet band, between the flexor tendons and cannon bone, over the lateral aspect of the hock, between the calcaneal tendon and tibia, up the poverty line to the hindquarters, to then track a line a couple of inches down from their sacrum, a couple of inches down from their tuba sacrale, and a couple of inches down from their spine, over the top of their scapular cartilage, a couple of inches down either side of their neck, and then finally between their ear and nuchal crest to the inside of their eye. This line can also be tracked both sides of the horse's body. I really love using intention and visualization with this line, combined with a very light touch, though you may have to adjust your touch to the horse's preference. I will start off by noticing and then regulating my breath, starting with a 5.5 in through my nose and 5.5 out through my nose. If this is hard for you, you may wish to work on this before trying Bladder Meridian. I will then place my fingers on the horse's coronet band and wait for a second to make sure they are happy with the pressure. Much like a lot of the techniques I use, I aim to use the same pressure I would use to stroke a baby bird, and this is something that you will need to check back in on as you head up the line. I will then start to move my fingers up the line, going against the horse's fur. Go slow here and notice your horse's response. Every blink or ear flick and posture change is communication. They are trying to tell us something, and we could try to determine what they are trying to tell us. This horse finds bodywork very challenging, especially around his head and neck. And what I notice is that before he lets go of tension, he will brace his neck and become hypervigilant. You can see here that he's starting to fidget around quite a lot, moving his head and neck and weight shifting. And then what you see is that he offloads his hindquarters, which indicates to me that he's starting to release tension through his hind end. As he's doing this and having a lick and a chew, I might step away and give him a minute to process that before restarting. And then notice as I've restarted, he has naturally adopted a slightly lower head and neck position, which indicates to me that we've just taken his nervous system down a peg. You can use their behavior as an indicator of where there might be tension. You might notice that the horse tenses their face or flicks an ear towards you or tightens their muzzle. Or, as I mentioned earlier with this guy, the first thing he will do is elevate his head and look for a threat in the distance. What's really lovely though is that you can see him starting to come down to a little bit more homeostasis. So he elevates his head and neck up, looks around, and then starts to lower his head to a more neutral position. Once I have regulated my breath and found my baby bird lightness, I will then add in visualizations. Feel free to freestyle it here, but my favourites are to imagine that my fingers are melting the skin like chocolate. You can add adjectives to this like velvety soft, or smooth, or warm, or luxurious. Anything which promotes a sense of relaxation. If I'm finding that challenging, which tends to happen if I have a horse with particularly chronic tension or who is particularly defensive about letting go of the tension, I might imagine a comforting scenario. This might be wrapping myself up in a soft warm blanket, or sitting by the fire, or laying on a sun lounger feeling the sensation of the warm sun on my skin, or melting into a nice hot bath after a long day. You can use anything which feels comforting to you. You can work as fast or slow along the line as you like, although my personal preference is to work slowly because I find I get more feedback from the horse that way. For some horses, you might have a tiny window of opportunity, which means that you can only work a small bit of the line. You might choose to work a section that doesn't feel threatening to them, so an area that doesn't seem too sensitive to the horse, or you might do a quick sweep up the line to see whether there are any areas that the horse doesn't tolerate, and you might adjust your touch over those areas or choose to come back to them another day. Remember that this should be horse led, and so if your horse is having a hard time, you can simply stop and then use that as information on how to help them differently. This guy had quite a lot of tension around his paraspinal muscles. So notice how, as I'm working along his lumbar area, his head has elevated up. Then what he does is he brings his head round to look at me. He could be indicating where there is tension. He could be trying to connect with me to say, hey, this is kind of difficult. Either way, my attempt is to acknowledge the fact he's communicating with me. And so I give my hand towards him, and then he starts to lick it. And then that helps him to move through feelings a little bit. This then stimulates a yawn response, which to me indicates again that his nervous system is coming down a peg. Yawns can mean different things. So I'm not looking to attach an association to the work I am doing per se, nor attaching a value to the work I'm doing. I'm not looking at this and thinking, oh, my work is working, but I am thinking, okay, this horse is starting to try to come back down to homeostasis, which for a horse that adopts a hypervigilant posture a lot, I see as a positive thing. From an equine physiotherapy perspective, I have found that working along the bladder meridian helps to generate relaxation as well as reduce tension along the horse's neck, back, and hindquarters. I absolutely love this technique as a way to connect with your horse and then to help you to notice and reduce restriction associated with the structures that are found along the line. If we were to look at a combination of theories about the body, this might look like reducing tension along the horse's superficial dorsal myofascial chain. For those of you who are bodywork trained or have an understanding of anatomy, you could visualize the muscles of the superficial dorsal line releasing or melting, or you could visualize a current of energy or a current of light filtering into the tissues you're targeting to help to release that chain. We are now getting to an area with this guy where he has a lot of tension and also a lot of negative emotions. We see him begin to creep up through his vigilance levels and become a lot more active through his head and neck. This is where we need to check in with our touch to make sure we haven't accidentally increased our own pressure. This is also where it might be harder to regulate our own breath. So do feel free to step away here, re-regulate yourself, and then start again. I personally find that this is where visualizing something that relaxes me can be really helpful, though the tension in the horse's body might kick you out of your visualization. You may also find it helpful to play around with a bit of approach and retreat here. So move back along the bladder meridian to somewhere that felt comfortable for your horse and then work back up to the tension spot. This will help you to move back to homeostasis, and your horse will pick up on that too, which in turn will help to cultivate that feeling of safety. Equally, some horses feel very stressed at the thought of pressure or intention, especially if your intention shifts more to a doing versus being state. This is where you might see stress related behaviors creeping in. You should also be mindful that your horse might be done with the session, even if you haven't finished that line. For this guy in this session, I couldn't work over C2 or C1 or his face. He elevated his stress levels, and I know that if I pushed it, I would have negated the benefit of all the previous work. It's always better to stop too soon than too late. If your horse's stress levels amplify, please do not feel like you have to keep going until you get them to relax again.